Hello again. Welcome to our 7th session of at ACI APAC Online. A good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the Middle East, Asia, and Asia Pacific. Last week, we heard our world business partner, Arab, lead in the conversation on the sustainable paradigm for Asia's greenfield airports. As always, for those who missed it last week, do visit our YouTube channel for the playback. Now, we've really appreciated the active engagement and participation in this at ACI online series by our world business partners. Did you know that the ACI Asia Pacific World Business Partner Program has over 100 members representing different business sectors serving the eVision ecosystem? These sectors represented include consultants, investors, airfield and equipment suppliers, information and communications technology and system service providers, security specialists, planning and construction experts, retail and commercial, marketing, media, and communication specialists, just to name a few. So if you're an airport procurement specialist seeking to source some new contacts, do check out our World Business Partner Program directory. More recently, we welcomed into membership a new sector, insurance broking and risk management. We're excited to have Marsh with us and lead in the conversation today. But before I introduce our moderator for today, check out this video.
After an unprecedented year for airports, with grounded planes and plummeting foot traffic, the airport landscape has been forced to rapidly evolve. With significant changes and a new normal, airport risks have radically evolved from what they were. A well-developed risk management program is essential to mitigate the changing risk profile. Introducing Marsh Airport Group, providing leading risk advisory and insurance solutions to the global airport community, with an emphasis on risk before insurance and consolidating Marsh's collective industry knowledge to allow the airport sector to manage risk and unlock possibility.
All right, without further ado, let's welcome our moderator, Patrina Miliauskas, Managing Principal at Marsh. Patrina, thanks for joining us from Sydney. The floor is all yours.
Welcome to the ACI online cyber discussion. Over the past 10 or so years, we have seen clients and my own company deal with cyber. Cyber risk has evolved from being an IT issue to the dependency on each individual in a company being vigilant in their everyday transactions. This more so now with the impacts of COVID and employees working from home. COVID has affected all industries, but from an airport perspective, it has led to a fast track in innovation and the necessity to adopt smart airport technologies in order to provide a safe and touchless environment for passengers and the wider airport community. With the drive towards digitalisation, airports have effectively changed their risk profile and need to ensure that they evolve their risk methodology in order to reassess that they are fit for a post-COVID travel environment. To help me explore this rapidly evolving topic, I am joined by a panel of experts representing the risk and insurance industry and airport sector. I'm very pleased to introduce Brian Piera. Brian is the Chief Financial Officer for Perth Airport. Talau Darius. Talau is leading the strategic risk consulting with Marsh Advisory in the Middle East. Magda Shelley. Magda is a keynote speaker and a senior cyber security expert within cyber advisory practice for Marsh Asia. Nicole Pavlicini. Nicole is in the cyber insurance team for Marsh Australia. Talau, I'd like to ask the first question to you, please. As a risk professional who has worked at a leading Middle East airport, what was digitalisation experience at airports pre-COVID?
Thank you very much, Patrina. Very interesting question. Airport operations and business models have evolved dramatically over the last decades to support the explosive growth of the global aviation industry. Regulatory reform in the new air travel era produced dramatic traffic growth, diversity, and choice for airline passengers. As airlines refine their operating models to align growth to efficiency, airports have also evolved in parallel to create massive networks of hubs and intelligent systems, which together create an efficient air transportation ecosystem, enabling an excellent passenger experience and journey from arrival at the airport, check-in, all the way to airplanes taking off. These technologies have enabled a better in-airport experience, efficiency and security, as well as airport accessibility. Considering larger hub airports with 70% of traffic as transit or transfer passengers who require an enjoyable passenger experience as well as reduction of waiting times. The implemented technologies have reduced overall transfer of passengers and baggage between flights, which is considered a key element when purchasing tickets with layovers. Not to mention the technologies across the different steps of air cargo, including cargo data management, e-freight, data processing, freighters, and handlers. Some technologies are also using OT and statistical analysis for better energy efficiency in the airfield and terminals and concourses. Investing in new technologies has risen as a priority for global airports. In particular, biometrics, smart airports, artificial intelligence have seen the highest increase. Some of the key examples, as passengers may know, could be mobile applications for maps and passenger locations, biometric identity management for check-in and passport control, including e-gates and e-passports, drones for emergency response, security, and fire response, as well as virtual reality passenger services. Of course, for airports to remain competitive, the operators and owners can choose to move into one of the several directions, either to physically expand the airports or deploy digital solutions, and selecting a path somewhere between the two. As a result, digitization advancements need to be accessible not only to airport workers, but to every passenger, which is why applications are being developed that could provide real-time flight information, gate number, boarding information, and access to a variety of VIP lounge service in airports. This also provides airport maps, and this helps travelers in and out of the airport. The aim is to improve the passenger experience as much as possible. One of the largest airports in Europe, for example, in Frankfurt, have even used artificial intelligence with a Franny robot to interact with airport passengers, answer their questions, help them orient, and hopefully increase the airport's appeal. Because airports are at the forefront of technological innovation, mainly due to the fact that the number of air travel passengers was exponentially increasing pre-COVID every year. As a result, airport enhances infrastructure intelligence and evolve as smart facilities to support growth by offering a pleasurable travel experience, which plays a vital role in increasing revenue in the aviation sector. New challenges are coming up, which aviation has to deal and adapt, such as the integration of industrial IoT in airport facilities and the increased use of bring your own device from travelers and employees. With the aim to enhance operational practices and develop a robust cybersecurity governance in smart airports, the security gaps in different areas, including technical, organizational practices, and policies. Airports are considered a gateway to the world for travelers and business. Thus, they are the great importance for country development and economic growth.
Now, in your role as a cyber-focused risk advisor at Marsh, what evolution have you seen as a result of COVID, and how are airports evolving in your region?
You know, Katrina, to see the difference between pre-COVID and post-COVID and how airports have evolved, I believe cybersecurity has become and is becoming a key enabler for safety. which is paramount in the aviation context. Smart airports strive to provide optimal services in a reliable and sustainable manner by working around the domains of growth, efficiency, safety, and security. I believe it is important to discuss the following 4 points. Importance of implementing effective, user-friendly technologies at each passenger touchpoint to protect passengers and the airport community staff. This includes seamless security checks, single token travel without the use of physical passports. Some examples are facial recognition at check-in, which has been implemented in Atlanta Airport for Delta and Amsterdam for KLM. The use of barcode scanners or facial recognition for lounge access, which is used by Alaska Airline lounges and Dubai airports. Self-bag drop, such as the one used at Changi Airport and travelers using Air New Zealand. And of course, the non-intrusive iris cameras used for immigration at Dubai airports. Number 2, the use of technologies which do not enable transmitting of infectious diseases. This is a key point that airport operators have really thought about, because passengers are not willing to use wearable devices or augmented reality goggles during their passenger experience. However, many airports have implemented technologies to monitor air quality, not just from a smoke or high CO2 levels, but to ensure infectious diseases are not being transmitted from AC air filtering systems. Number 3, acknowledging the urgency and importance of protecting civil aviation critical infrastructure, information and communication technology systems. We all know that information available within airport operators is essential and confidential. It also includes the reliance on data sets coming from airlines, ground handlers, the government, police, state security. So that all requires a very robust cyber resilience framework to be implemented. Number 4, increased reliance on technology, especially the technologies of the future, such as Internet of Things, robotics, and all of these create a more susceptible ecosystem for cyber attacks, which could include attacks on confidentiality, availability, and integrity of information. I would also like to highlight that evolution is a slow process. Although the world around us changes rapidly, human beings remain relatively unchanged. In the next stage of the pandemic, airports and airlines will need to learn how to cope with widely uneven operating environments. However, due to the pandemic and the impacts of it on passenger traffic, revenues from aeronautical and non-aeronautical perspective impacted the profit and loss. That's why we've seen airports rapidly evolve to cope and evolve, which would require an increased cyber resilience framework to be implemented, which my colleague will be talking on in further detail. Thank you, Patrina.
Thanks, Talal. I do have to say, Talal, that pre-COVID, I know that Australian airports were working towards facial recognition with Qantas, and also the robots were being used to enhance the customer experience. So I think we're moving in the right direction. Thank you.
100%.
Brian, as the CFO of a leading APAC airport, you are truly seeing the realities of COVID. Can you give us some understanding as to the true impact and how you have tried to adapt?
Thanks, Patrina, and a very good question. I guess it's been a bit of a roller coaster ride for us as an airport. And if I take you back to the early onset of this, if we take you back to, say, late February, early March 2020, I think as a management team, as an airport, we began to realise how significant an impact the developing COVID situation at that time was going to have on our business. We started to see it with international flights being cancelled, which then led to the international border being closed for Australia. And then very quickly after that, the West Australian border, which Perth is in, being closed as well. And as a management team, we had to act pretty quickly to try and adapt and protect the remaining part of our business, aero business, and also to help facilitate repatriation flights, which the government at the time was doing. So just by way of background, Perth Airport operates 5 terminals, and pre-COVID, we were about 15 million passengers per annum. About 25% of those passengers was 3.7 million of those passengers were within the state of Western Australia as well, just primarily supporting the mining and mining services industry. And for those of you who don't know, mining and mining services underpins the WA economy significantly. So we realised that to ensure that the airport could still support the mining industry and the mining services industry, we needed to make the airport as safe as possible and to make sure our customers felt safe and their passengers and our mining company passengers were safe in actually traversing through the airport to get onto a plane and ultimately to mine sites. So we instituted very quickly enhanced cleaning regimes, including new products that had longer surface protection times and even products that could be dispersed by aerosol. We implemented social distancing measures within the terminals. We rolled out touch-free sanitizer stations across the terminals, implemented very quickly perspex screens on check-in desks, green channels to separate, clean flights from certain destinations from flights that might have hotel quarantine requirements that the government required. And then for customers who were even traversing through the airport, we saw an increase preposition for people to actually drive to the airport and park at the airport rather than catching Ubers and taxis, all for a safety point of view. So we quickly started directing all our passengers through online channels for car parking to minimise contact with people. We introduced license plate recognition and hand wave technology in all our car parks, again, to minimise touch points. And so really trying to make sure that people felt safe, they didn't feel like they were touching things, they didn't feel like they were interacting with people too much. We worked with mining companies, and each of the large mining companies here had special requirements, and we had to facilitate their requirements for COVID testing. Many of the mining companies instituted their own pre-boarding checks for each of their people. So every one of their people would go through some sort of temperature test, or COVID test, even blood testing that was done for antigen testing, which would give a result within 15 minutes. And we facilitated those with in terms of blood tents that needed to go be supported and the like. We also facilitated all the additional federal and state government authorities' requirements within all our terminals for the WA Police, the state and federal health authorities and the Australian Border Force. And based on all this work, I think we're very proud to have been the first airport in Australia to get the COVID Safe accreditation from ACI in early October last year. And we did all this, I think, in an agile way while running a busy airport. We were, in the latter half of 2020, the busiest airport in Australia, I think primarily because we didn't have a significant international part of the business. It was all very much within the state. We also, in that time, delivered a major upgrade in our international terminals to introduce self-service check-in and bag drop that Talal mentioned earlier, and which went live. And that technology that we bought also allowed us to roll out ultimately biometrics to actually then deliver a touchless, seamless journey going forward. And that is something we've accelerated. We had always intended to move down that biometrics journey. It's something we've accelerated, and we're now trialling that in a couple of our gates, again, to be as ready as possible when international borders open. We also at the same time introduce within our retail space at-table online ordering, payment for food and beverage in our terminals, again to minimise that contact, so someone could sit at a table, order their food, pay for it, and someone would just deliver it to their table. So this really was all about enhancing our touchless, seamless journey. And then I guess in parallel, in the midst of COVID, no different to other airports, we had to deal with all the normal issues of airlines and retailers going into administration, working with retailers to restructure contractual terms for late payments and the like. So from a risk perspective, very early on, we just had a very frank discussion with our board and highlighted what we thought were the two main risks that we needed to manage. One being cash flow, and then two being cyber risk. And from a cash flow point of view, we did all the normal things you'd expect us to do: monitor cash on a daily basis, increase and bolster our liquidity, term out our short-term debt, manage our own cost base, and take some very hard decisions around people and services while still focusing on safety. And from a cyber risk, there were some new problems that we face. People working from home introduced new risks in terms of access to systems, but also processes, making sure that from a cyber risk perspective, people couldn't actually take advantage of that and, penetrate our systems through, fraudulent financial transactions, or even just hacking or hijacking our systems. So we undertook a couple of things. One, independent penetration testing that we took on board to make sure that our systems were resilient. We hired a young hacker from one of the firms to make sure that independently we said, go for it, try and hack through our systems to understand where the vulnerabilities were and then to lock those away as quickly as we could. We also, at the same time, increased staff awareness of social engineering attacks, things like USBs that we were lying about so that if someone picked it up and plugged it in, or emails that were purporting to be from certain people asking for certain transactions. We had to make sure we had our people more alert and aware of those things, and we did some real-time testing around that. And we also, I guess in the context of ransomware, we were conscious that given where most of us were working from home and the like, ransomware attacks were also an issue. So we took the opportunity to also increase the resilience of our systems to that. Overall, there was a lot of change and a lot of non-normal activities that we had to undertake with some agility to make sure that we were responding to the changes operationally, at the same time making sure the back end, and as part of the new technologies we're introducing, making sure at the back end we were cyber resilient and ready for anything that could be thrown our way.
Thank you, Brian. It certainly sounds like Perth Airport has been very, very busy. How do you see digitalisation supporting you in helping Perth to manage and recover from COVID?
Yeah, so as I've touched on, Katrina, I think digitalisation for us is critical for Perth Airport as we recover. I think, as we mentioned, we've accelerated the pace of our investment in technology to improve the passenger journey through the airport. Our aim ultimately is to create a touchless, seamless journey for the passenger right through from the point in time when before they even leave home. So getting people to check in online or prepay for their car parking online for a specific designated car park, arriving at their car park where license plate recognition would allow them in. When they get to the terminal, self-service check-in, including passport verification and bag drop, self-service bag drop. As I mentioned earlier, online ordering and payment of food and beverage, online ordering of duty-free and other retail through our digital marketplace that we're about to launch and go live with, again, to minimise the interaction and touch points with people. And as I mentioned earlier, biometrics, which is under trial, which will allow passengers to navigate right through security, border control, and boarding a gate onto a plane with minimal human interaction. And we see the seamless journey as a competitive advantage. We see that as an ability to regain the confidence of people to travel again, and something that we are very conscious of will be a competitive space when borders reopen. And we also see ultimately point-to-point travel becoming more attractive. And Perth Airport, we feel, is strategically located as Australia's Western gateway, and we see that as point-to-point travel back into Europe, Asia, and Africa, and then ultimately a hub, if you come through Perth, a hub to the rest of Australia where we already have great point-to-point connectivity. And digitalisation we see as the levelling playing field for smaller airports like Perth Airport, and the social health implications of travel in the wake of COVID is only going to accelerate that levelling of that playing field. And so for us, it's accelerating our investment and into digitalisation, blending, making sure our newer systems merge with our older systems, and as we increase our investment in that space, making sure, more importantly, that the cyber risks that we continue to open ourselves up to are minimised. And obviously, we have to continually keep abreast of this ever-changing landscape, ensure that we're continually adapting and responding. And I think we're very conscious that we cannot be complacent in the world of cyber risk.
Thank you, Brian. Do you think that COVID has helped assist with customers adapting to the digitalisation world that the airports are entering into?
Yeah, we're seeing customers actually embrace it. They're actually demanding that sort of interaction, and what we've seen is growth. If I use our car parking business as an example, we now have over 60% of our transactions all online, something that we would never have envisaged would have happened pre-COVID, not that quickly anyway. And so we're finding that giving the customer the chance or the option to go online has been embraced. In fact, we're seeing that grow month on month. Absolutely, Katrina.
Thank you. That's fantastic news to hear. Magda, I've got a couple of questions for you, if you don't mind. We are hearing a lot about airport digitalisation, evolution, and concerns around heightened cyber exposure. Can I ask, is cyber risk a new risk for the aviation industry?
Thank you, Katrina. It's really a very interesting topic in general around the aviation, digitalization, but as well cyber risks that are emerging. Now, as the leader for cyber in the Asian region, I would like to say that this question comes back very often. What are our exposures? Are we having any exposures at all when it comes to cyber? So let me take a step back and put everything in context. We are talking in the aviation industry about an environment that is pretty complex, where we have not only different assets part of the environment, including information technology assets, but as well OT, like Talal mentioned, operational technology asset. But as well, we have a very important number of stakeholders. Those stakeholders can be passengers, can be third parties, airlines, providers. And basically, we have, again, a very complex environment. Now, all those assets are being exposed to particular threats. And when they are exposed to particular threats, cyber criminals are able to exploit those threats and perform their cyber attacks. And as such, I will start with a very simple and probably very relatable example for the aviation industry. A cyber attack on a baggage handling system. So this system is using the traditional legacy systems, industrial systems. And while often we might perceive that they are not hackable, and I'm being very careful here about the word that I'm using, they are, and they might be as well being very much more exposed than the information technology or the enterprise systems as such. Why? Because they are legacy systems, because they are old industrial systems, and therefore they do not have a lot of security controls in place. Now, this particular example that I mentioned, a baggage handling system compromise, might actually lead to significant disruption in case of an attack. And the attack can happen with just a malicious software being uploaded into that system. Now, of course, the disruption not only leads to serious disruption for the passengers, but for the airlines in general and for the airport in general as well. So the risks are not only related to just a particular cyber attack. We're talking about, again, complex environments with different assets. And some of those assets are including industrial systems, legacy systems that already previously or traditionally have been exposed to cyber threats and might definitely raise cyber risk for the industry, including, or for example, operation paralysis, business disruptions, and supply chain disruption, including third parties. And while we already have those exposures with traditional systems and legacy systems, now we are talking with digitalization and the adoption of new technologies.
Thank you, Magna. Magna, how does digitalization affect cyber risks for the aviation industry?
And that's where actually, Petrina, why I stopped, because the digitalization, if we look at what and how it's impacting the traditional cyber exposure, is as well very fascinating topic. We're talking about smart airports. We're talking about ensuring a seamless and superb new experience for the passengers. And while we are adopting and changing this travel experience for the passengers, we're bringing on new technologies. Talal mentioned industrial Internet of Things. We're having devices, connected devices across this environment that has been already very complex. And every time when we are bringing a new technology, like, again, Internet of Things or any other new technology like big data, we might talk about robotics, we might talk about artificial intelligence, biometric. We are bringing as well new potential exposures. Those exposures are related to those new technologies that will be adapted or adopted by the new assets. And of course, they will bring as well the potential opportunities for cyber criminals to exploit. Now, again, a step back here to understand why I'm bringing these new technologies and mentioning that they are increasing exposure of the aviation industry. Very often we have this perception that because we are adopting a new technology, that technology will come in with the security and privacy by default. Well, let me clarify this for our audience. There is absolutely no technology that comes in with security by default or 100 security. Every technology that is out there has its own exposures and its own vulnerabilities. Now, those vulnerabilities, again, might be taken advantage or exploited by cyber criminals. Therefore, every time when we're bringing new technologies, every time when we're trying to make our airports smarter, improve our passengers' experience, we're actually expanding the possible attack surface for cyber criminals to use. Now, every time when we do that, I think what is as well important to understand is that whenever a cyber attack occurs, which actually will target one of those assets exposed to certain cyber threats, it might not only lead to a particular system disruption, it might actually lead to a complete paralysis of operation, including third parties, as I mentioned at the beginning. And now, while we're talking about such disruption, we are immediately talking about costs and financial losses that those businesses, including, again, third parties, might be exposed to. And I would like to go a little bit further into those details, but I want to come back on what Brian mentioned, and I think it's extremely important to understand that there are as well security controls that are very beneficial for all companies, all businesses, including aviation industry, to perform, like penetration testing. And penetration testing is a simulated cyber attack, which is done before the real malicious cyber criminals perform the attack, help companies to fix their security gaps. Because again, there's no system that comes in with 100% security and it's perfect. You need, as a company or as a business stakeholder, to continuously try to ensure that there is a monitoring of eventual vulnerabilities and gaps within your whole ecosystem and not just within a particular area or asset. So now, whenever we're talking about those cyber attacks and eventually performing simulated cyber attacks, as I mentioned, it might lead to various cyber risks that materialize. Those cyber risks might lead to operation paralysis, business disruption, data breach, and that, of course, means liabilities as well, eventual fines, etc. But what we need to understand is that the costs are not only related to the immediate disruption of business. We might have costs associated following a cyber attack related to service providers that we need to hire. For example, a company that will investigate what happened, or a legal provider to help with any legal liabilities that the cyber attack might lead towards. So whenever we are discussing about cyber risk, those cyber risks are evolving, like you mentioned, Petrina, at the beginning, not only from an IT problem, but they're becoming a real cyber or business risk, and they might impact the whole ecosystem as we are not working in silos anymore. And again, as a point here that, relates to the overall topic of today, when we talk about cyber risk and management of the cyber risk, providing a proper framework, it is as well critical for every company and for our audience to understand that 100% security is neither the right goal, neither achievable. And therefore, it is very effective to have the right measures which will help to reduce impact or likelihood of cyber attack, but as well to understand that risk transfer is part of an effective and efficient cyber risk management framework and process.
Thank you, Magna. It certainly sounds like all companies, not just airports, need to make sure they have a pre-cyber and a post-cyber plan in place to manage these risks. Nicole, where does an airport start in terms of understanding their cyber exposure?
Thanks, Petrina. That's a really good question, and something I think from an insurer perspective they somewhat grapple with. So what Magna alluded to, the key risk exposures for the aviation industry are some of the aircraft operations, the baggage handling systems, the air traffic control. And from an insurer perspective, they really want to understand what the impact might be across the suite of the insurance policy. So what does that supply chain impact look like? So how does an organisation understand what their cyber risks are? So firstly, it's important for organisations to understand what cyber loss scenarios they might face and how they could impact the business, particularly going further around the supply chain impact as well, which has been touched on quite frequently throughout today's session. Following that, we would then ultimately tailor a cyber risk register using language that the organisation speaks to. So not insurance language, not IT, quite layman's terms, so everyone within the organisation can understand the risks associated with that. It's important once those two steps have been undertaken that all cyber risks are shared with the stakeholders, and you can do that by undertaking board level presentations or workshops which might bring out further risks that the businesses face. Looking at the risk register, you then obviously have a set of exposures that the organisation is faced with. So what do we do with that? It's important that you quantify the risks that the organisation face, because if an organisation doesn't quantify those risks, how do they know what the appropriate risk transfer solution might look like? Is it more cost effective to retain on the balance sheet? Should I be considering investing in IT technology? Or should I be looking at insurance as a transfer? So forecasting the direct exposure based on the cyber risks that have been identified throughout the risk register and looking at what the impact might be. You can also look at obviously live claims that we're seeing in the market at the moment, which we might touch on in a little bit more detail later on. But quite critical for this component would be understanding the business interruption exposure and the supply chain impact. Now, from an insurer perspective, particularly in the aviation space, we're being faced with a lot of challenging questions around how are organisations managing this business interruption exposure. And I've personally gone through this with a number of my airport clients that I've been working on over the past 12 months. And it's really important to Lal and Magna's points to understand what the infrastructure looks like from an IT and OT perspective, and whether or not there's segmentation in place and each component of the business is isolated from one another to prevent the, I guess, paralysis that Magna was alluding to. Now, following that, it's important to undertake, I guess, a cybersecurity health check on the organisation. So to assist with that, we typically work with our clients to undertake a self-assessment. Now, typically the self-assessment aligns with the NIST framework. So an organisation's ability to be able to identify, detect, protect, recover and respond to a cyber incident. Following completion of the self-assessment, it enables us to identify strengths and weaknesses within the organisation around their controls and procedures and the mechanisms to help them, I guess, become more resilient to cyber incidents.
Thank you. From those solutions, in your experience, what positive outcomes have you seen from clients being able to proactively articulate to insurers how they are managing their cyber risk?
You're throwing some really good questions out here today. This is actually quite a challenging question to answer at the moment. I'm sure everyone is quite familiar with some of the challenges that the cyber insurance market is facing at the moment. So historically, we would be able to utilise the strength of the business's controls and procedures in order to leverage better terms and conditions and insurance solutions for our clients. However, over the course of the last 18 months, we've seen a significant uptick in severity of ransomware events, but also managed service provider incidents. That has obviously led to insurers heavily scrutinising controls and procedures that organisations have in place. So when we put that into context from an insurance perspective, it's quite critical for organisations to undertake regular updates around, their incident response capabilities, business continuity plans, disaster recovery, but also making sure that the organisation has the ability to monitor staff that are working in a remote workforce or work from home. So continually communicating, I guess, the cyber security awareness programs is quite critical, and it's about bringing the organisation's culture along with, I guess, the threat landscape that we're being faced with at the moment, particularly from a ransomware perspective. Now, I think Brian kind of alluded to earlier that, ransomware is quite topical. And as a result of some of the ransomware events that are going on within the market, insurers are really looking at organisations, multi-factor authentication, so ensuring that multi-factor authentication is rolled out across the whole network, including remote access. And I think what we have found historically with the aviation sector is kind of what Magna was alluding to earlier around the legacy infrastructure and the upgrades that are occurring due to digitalisation. And typically there may be a gap in a common control such as multi-factor authentication. So it's critical that, that has been rolled out across the organisation. Not only that, we're looking at insureds, ensuring that there's endpoint protections across every single endpoint. So insurers are putting quite onerous controls onto organisations to bring the cyber risk maturity level up, which is something that organisations ultimately should be doing anyway. But I guess from a legacy perspective, it can become quite challenging for organisations to kind of fast track the implementation of some of the critical applications that are required in order to, I guess, prevent and mitigate cyber exposures.
Thank you, Nicole.
So, Petrina, I would like actually to add on top and emphasize on Nicole's point around security controls for the aviation industry. I think it is very important to clarify that whenever we are building a cybersecurity strategy, it all, of course, depends on the company's risk appetite. However, as we have industry standards like NIST, they help us with the basic fundamentals, ensuring that we have at least those implemented. Now, when it comes to basic or certain security controls that we have heard previously with Nicole, it all comes down to a defense in depth approach. Whenever we are implementing one control, every control actually might as well fail. And therefore, that's where we need to always have an additional control in case the previous one fails. And that's what we call a defense in depth. Additionally, of course, when we're talking about legacy systems and especially systems like in the operational technology environment, we are unable sometimes to deploy the same controls as within the information technology enterprise systems. And Nicole mentioned as well segmentation. So let me give you a practical example. We're talking about an ICS, industrial control system, that is a legacy system unable to be updated. Therefore, a compensating control can be a very good control to keep cyber criminals away. And that compensating control, as an example, might be segmentation. So if we are looking at the various control that needs to be implemented for organizations as complex as organizations within the aviation industry, it's not just a matter of a few checklist controls. It's a matter of really having an in-depth approach, an understanding of cyber risk and eventual scenarios, and then matching your controls that will enable your organization to stop a cyber attack from happening or to reduce the impact of that cyber attack. And when we're talking about as well MFA or multi-factor authentication, which is as well something very interesting as a last point that I would like to bring to our audience, it is something that by default is asked very often by underwriters or insurance because a password is able to be cracked very easily. So let me tell you just very quickly, an 8-character password that is all numbers, or basically an 8-character numerical password, is crackable in less than 2 seconds. Yes, indeed, you heard me right, 2 seconds. And therefore, if your systems and if your accounts have only the passwords as measure of authentication, cyber criminals are able to exploit that and use it in order to get access to your accounts. Therefore, this is why we recommend whenever possible to implement multi-factor authentication. Now, again, as a last point, aside from this tip, remember, it's not about just a few controls, it's about understanding your assets, having a very clear visibility of the threats that the assets are exposed to, and then deploying the controls that will stop those threats from being exploited by cyber criminals. The approach needs to be a defense in-depth approach because a security control can fail as well. And therefore, if you have a defense in-depth, another security control will be able to eventually stop or reduce the likelihood, as I mentioned, of a cyber attack. So it is all about a continuous journey. It's not about one day or 1 week exercise. It's about having a proper cyber risk management, including identification, mitigation, but as well transfer, all helping you to ensure a cost-effective management of cyber risk.
Thank you, Magna. Nicole, with the change in environment, how is the insurance market reacting?
Thanks, Petrina. So from an insurance market perspective, over the last 8 to 10 months, we have seen a significant increase in the severity of ransomware. Ransomware is continually causing insurers, I guess, grief, particularly given the quantum that we're now seeing from an initial demand perspective. If we were discussing this maybe this time last year, we probably would have said that the average demand was sitting at around $1 million. As of, I guess, the end of Q1 this year, we would say that the average ransom demand is now sitting at $10 to $15 million, with the largest ransom actually being paid just this month of $40 million, sorry. And that was for an insurance company. So as a result of, I guess, the ransom demands and obviously the ongoing impact from a business interruption perspective, the costs of restoration, the insurance market has hardened quite quickly. So not only are we being faced with the severity of ransomware, we're now starting to see large aggregation risk exposures. A lot of organisations are using outside service providers to assist them in, I guess, their operating businesses. So the likes of Microsoft, as an example. In December last year, there was an increase in systemic risks such as SolarWinds, Acelion, the Microsoft Exchange. Now, as a result of these, insurers are now looking at how many of their insureds utilise outside service providers so they can understand what the increase in claims activities may be when one of these large service providers is impacted. So that's having quite an impact from an insurer perspective. But those three incidents that I've mentioned are also having an impact on insured's supply chain, which is quite similar to what the risk can be faced from an aviation perspective. Given all of this, the insurers are becoming quite reactive and their loss ratios are worsening. So that's leading to corrective action. Given this, we're seeing insurers reduce capacity, but also consider alternate structures from a ransomware perspective, including sublimiting of ransom demands or co-insurance of ransom demands. So the insurer may potentially pay half of the demand and the insured is to bear the other half. This is to assist them in, I guess, returning to profitability or maintaining profitability to ensure that, moving forward, the insurance market is sustainable. Now, in terms of the threats that we've just kind of discussed, there is a trend and it's typically across critical infrastructure. So we've seen significant upticks in claims against healthcare clients, manufacturing, aviation, but logistics, so transportation, and also professional services firms. So I guess no business is actually immune from the risks that we're seeing within the market. And as a result of that, I think, we've all collectively talked about, the controls and procedures organisations need to have in place in order to, one, obtain insurance, but also maintain that moving forward, because insurers' underwriting guidelines are now focused on insureds having a better risk and their risk maturities being higher. And should those insureds not meet their minimum standards, they're actually starting to decline businesses, and therefore some clients can't get insurance unless they go through the process of ensuring that they're prepared, they have the right controls in place, they can identify and protect, mitigate and contain and respond to an incident. They're unlikely to get insurance.
Thank you, Nicole. I think we can safely say that the airport sector's cybersecurity has changed since COVID, paving the way for advancements in technology beyond the pre-COVID environment, with facial recognition, robots, self-check-in baggage systems and other like systems to improve passenger experience and safety. This requires continual review of controls, I would like to thank our panellists today, Talal, Brian, Magda and Nicole, for your time to review cyber risk. Thank you to all of you for joining us for today's ACI online presentation.
Thank you, Petrina, and all the panelists for your time, especially since several of you are in different parts of Australia and your day is winding down already. Magda, we still have time for an afternoon coffee, while Talal, you still have a full day ahead of you. Now we'll stay online in the chat box for a few more minutes in case anyone has burning questions. If you have colleagues who wanted to join today but couldn't, do let them know the playback video will be available on our YouTube channel soon. Now don't forget to join us next week for the grand finale of @ACI APEC Online. Many of you have enjoyed hearing from our airport leaders, especially on the first CEOs Forum. We've heard your requests. Join us next Tuesday for CEOs Forum 2.0 and hear what our airport leaders from Hyderabad, Tahiti, Muscat, and Incheon have to say about what they think the new normal will look like. Thanks for joining us today.
See you next week.